Okay, well, it's 11:32. I think we should begin now. Some others may join us as we get going here. So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. It's nice to see people here from, I can see that there are people here from both sides of the Atlantic. So welcome everybody, and lots of students as well. My name is Sheila Petty, and I'm a professor in the Department of Film, Faculty of Art and Performance at the University of Regina. And I'm very pleased to welcome all of you on behalf of our department to our annual film lecture series. This year, we are very proud to host playwright and filmmaker Maimouna Diallo. Before I introduce Maimouna, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Regina is federated with 3 colleges: the First Nations University of Canada, Campion College, and Luther College. The University of Regina is situated on Treaty 4 lands with a presence in Treaty 6. These are the territories of the Nahaiyawak, Anishinaabeg, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis Michif Nation. Today, these lands continue to be the shared territory of many diverse peoples from near and far. We honor the ancestors. Many people or units have helped bring this special event together today. So I would like to thank the film department and department head Mike Rollo and department administrative assistant Andrea Stakowicz, the Faculty of Media Art and Performance at the University of Regina, Audiovisual Services and Patrick Andrews, Dr. Kristina Stoyanova and Professor Sheila Petty for organizing their classes around this presentation, Giovanna Nabaretti Souza Cruz and Babatunde Onikoyi for creating the brilliant poster for the event, you can see it behind me, and for hosting the upcoming screening of Tales of the Accidental City at the Regina Public Library on Wednesday at 7 p.m. And Maimouna Diallo for graciously accepting to present her film and discuss it with us today. I will introduce Maimouna, and then she will introduce her film. We will screen the film, all still on Zoom, so don't leave the Zoom call. And then there will be time for questions and discussion after the screening. So during the screening, please keep your mics and cameras off. But while Maimouna is speaking, it would be nice to have cameras on. Maimouna Diallo is a multidisciplinary African feminist artist and content creator. In 2021, she released her debut film, Tales of the Accidental City. She is the author of the children's book, I'm the Color of Honey, and in 2018 edited an anthology of 12 reimagined African folk tales entitled Story, Story, Story Come. She has written and directed several stage plays, and also Maimouna toured 4 continents with a one-woman adaptation of Lola Shoyin's The Secret Lives of Baba Segi's Wives. Prior to that, Maimouna worked as a producer for the BBC World Service and as regional communication officer for Doctors Without Borders in the Horn of Africa region. She continues to facilitate storytelling and communications workshops for a wide range of organizations. Maimouna sits on the advisory boards of This Is Africa and Wirico. She holds an MA in African Literature from the University of London. I first met Maimouna last September at the African Movie Festival in Manitoba. The 323-seat theater at Winnipeg's Gas Station Arts Centre was packed, and the audience rolled with laughter, as I'm sure you will today when we watch her film. So please join me in welcoming Maimouna Diallo. Over to you, Maimouna.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Professor Sheila Petty. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. And thank you to the University of Regina for hosting this event. I have a confession to make. I like firsts. The film you're going to see today is my first, but also this is my very first guest lecture at a university, so it's really very special to me. So thank you all for being here today. As I thought about what to share today, I remembered what I always teach when I run storytelling or communications workshops, that most stories, not every story, but most stories have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So I decided to tell you a bit about my beginnings and my initial relationship with film or lack thereof. I'll speak about why I made this film and the process of making it. And seeing as in life, unlike in stories, none of us knows exactly how, when, or where it will all end. I'll leave the what next question to the Q&A session at the end. So I call myself an accidental filmmaker, not only because it rhymes with the title of the film, Tales of the Accidental City, but because if you'd asked me even just 6 months before making this film, if I had any intention or even an interest in writing and directing a film, I probably would have said no. I didn't study film. I wasn't, and I'm still not, an expert in African cinema. And I didn't even grow up very exposed to film. I grew up in Lomé, Togo, a small francophone country in West Africa. This was in the 1980s, and we didn't have much access to films. The national TV broadcaster came on at 7 p.m. with the local language news. At 8 p.m., we had the international news. And then on Thursdays, the whole city stood still as everyone watched the Brazilian soap opera, Isaura the Slave Girl. It was broadcast only once a week for 30 minutes or perhaps an hour, my memory fails me. And there were 100 episodes. So as you can imagine, this was a fixture in our lives for many years. And for anyone who's lived on the African continent, you know that if electricity cut on Thursday evenings, you could literally hear the entire city groaning. The only other films I had access to were a few pirated films that my dad had bought for my sister and I on one of his trips to Nigeria. We don't condone piracy, but in those days, it was really hard to get films in any other way where I was. These films were The Sound of Music, which we watched nearly every single weekend as I fell deeper and deeper in love with Captain Von Trapp. There was Mary Poppins, and then there was Chucky, Child's Play. If you haven't seen Chucky, it's a terrifying 1988 horror film about a serial killer doll. So deceived into thinking that it was a kid's movie because of the title, my dad had no idea what he was buying. And I remember when he gave it to me, I was 10 years old at the time. And I still remember putting the video cassette into the player and being transfixed by what I saw on screen. I couldn't even move. I was so scared. All I'll tell you is that for months after watching it, I slept on the floor and gave my bed to my dolls and teddy bears, praying that they wouldn't wake up at night and kill me. So as you could see, I've had a interesting and complicated relationship with film. As a young adult living in London, there was a DVD rental shop near my flat, which mostly stocked independent films. And that is when I started exploring cinema more. I loved watching French movies and Spanish movies. I think mainly because hearing these languages, the languages of my childhood, my mother is Spanish, and in Togo we spoke French, gave me a real sense of home. But if I'm honest, my real love was books. I read voraciously. I wrote poems and short stories. I collected proverbs and quotes, and I stuck them all around my bedroom walls. And perhaps unsurprisingly, I ended up doing a master's in African literature at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. After that, I became a journalist, covering a lot of hard news. And then I worked in communications in NGOs. Sheila mentioned there, Doctors Without Borders, which was one of them. And often I was covering disease outbreaks, refugee crises, sexual and gender-based violence in urban slums. And whilst these experiences have shaped who I am today, after a decade of this kind of writing and reporting, my heart was really heavy. And I also felt that I was getting farther and farther away from that initial joy, of creating characters and making up stories and writing them down. So 6 years ago, driven by the urge to tell stories that I wanted to tell, I left full-time employment. And I first embarked on a project to collect traditional African folktales. I had a young son at the time, he's now a teenager, and I felt that it was important to preserve this really beautiful heritage for him and of course for other children. When stories are passed down orally, when the storytellers die, the stories die with them. So I did this with a real sense of urgency. And I traveled to Zanzibar in search of stories. I spoke to elderly people, to some TV actors, professional storytellers, mothers, teachers, writers, and they shared their stories with me, but also a profound sense of loss. They would say, kids are not interested in our stories. They have television, they have computer games, and now that we're in the city, everyone works and no one has time to tell stories. And it felt like something was dying. And that something was not just tradition. It was an art form, a very important tool in creating community, sharing values and passing down a legacy. The more I delved into stories, the more I became obsessed with the need for us as Africans to tell our own stories. Stories are how we see ourselves and the world around us. And I remember a friend of mine who owns a bookstore in Johannesburg saying, if children do not see themselves as heroes in stories, how will they imagine that they can be heroes in real life? Growing up, all I wanted to be was one of the Von Trapp children, preferably Liesel, with her blue eyes and her flowing brown hair, because she was the most present fictional character in my life at the time. So by the time I left Zanzibar, I was on a mission, not only to preserve these old stories, but to create new opportunities for African writers to write new ones that represent us in all our complexities and that challenge the very heteronormative way that traditional stories depict characters. So there are a lot of girl heroes. One of the heroes in the book is a blind girl, and so on. I launched an online contest, and in the end, we published the anthology that Sheila mentioned of 12 reimagined folktales called Story, Story, Story Come. And then I came up with the idea that we could perhaps also preserve oral storytelling form using contemporary novels. So then I started adapting novels by African women writers into performances like Lola Shoning's Baba Segi's Wives. It was amazing because I was back in the world of words and creativity. And this, eventually led me to this film, Tales of the Accidental City. Tales of the Accidental City has had many iterations. It started off as a series of short stories. Then it became a 3-part audio drama, then a play, which because of COVID was never staged. And finally, the experimental film that you're going to watch today. And it all started with a writing group made up of friends. We'd meet as often as we could in my garden in Nairobi, and we'd write, read our work in progress, offer each other feedback. And in 2019, we decided to write a series of short stories that would explore what life is like for Nairobi residents 120 years after its so-called creation. And I say so-called because the history books tell us that Nairobi was founded in 1899 by the colonial authorities in British East Africa as a rail depot on the Uganda Railway. But of course, we also know that there were people there before. We know that the Kikuyu, who are agriculturalists, lived in the area, the Akamba, and the Maasai, who are pastoralists, and they would come and go grazing their cattle. The name Nairobi itself is derived from the Maasai phrase, Enkare Nairobi, which translates to place of cool waters, in reference to the Nairobi River, which flows through the city. Built on swampland, this city would perhaps never have been the sprawling city of nearly 5 million inhabitants that live there today without that colonial encounter. But 120 years later, and nearly 60 years after independence, we wanted to explore the myriad of lives and stories that make up the city today. I'll tell you a bit about the short stories, because without the short stories, Tales of the Accidental City doesn't exist. So my friend and former colleague, Kevin Wachiro, wrote about a group of street hawkers, including the young Sarah Obama. She wasn't the central character, but then she did become so in my film. And she represents one of the many people who live in the cracks, who are rendered invisible, who are chewed up and spat out by a city that is often hostile to the poor. Margaret Muthe, a recent mother of twins, read a newspaper article about a kidnapping syndicate in Kayole, and she imagined what it would be like to leave the village and to come to the city in search of a new life, full of dreams, only for your child to be stolen from you. Sitawa Namwalye, who's a wonderful poet and writer and performer, decided to write about another real event, a time when the city council members painted all of the billboards in Nairobi black. None of us believed this, but it actually happened. And they did this to force business owners who wanted to advertise on them to pay extortionate rates. What I loved about her story was that she didn't write from the perspective of the corrupt and salacious government bigwigs, but from the perspective of Louis, a lone ranger trying to do good in a broken system. And as for me, I birthed Jacinda, the woman who is not afraid to speak truth to power, the domestic worker, carer, protector, defender, who in the end represents our collective conscience. Our short stories edited and ready for publication. We couldn't find a publisher. It's notoriously difficult to publish anthologies of short stories, apparently. So the manuscript sat on our computers for months. But I had fallen in love with this melee of characters. And I knew that we had to look at other ways of setting them free in the world. And so I asked the group if I could adapt their stories into a play, and they agreed. And I asked myself, how do I make it work? Will it be a series of monologues, independent standalone stories with each character recounting their own experience? No, it didn't feel right, and it felt too simple, too direct. How could I connect their stories? And how could Nairobi itself become a character through their stories? And then it struck me that what connected them was anger, frustration, a sense of powerlessness. And in many ways, they reflected my own feelings about living in a city where every day I saw hardworking people trying to make it with little or no support. A city where it seemed that people thrived in spite of, not thanks to, government policies. Where the gap between rich and poor is, quite frankly, disgustingly glaring. Where, as my friend, the Nigerian writer Chuma Nwokolo says, in Africa, we're not dying of malaria, we're dying of corruption. After 10 years in Nairobi, I was angry too, and frustrated and powerless. And it was a city that I realized that I both absolutely loved, but also loathed. And then COVID hit, and it was great. I can't lie. And, it was a terrible time for many people. I don't want to take away from that. But for me, with the world at a standstill and no distractions, it allowed me to write and write and write. And as the characters started speaking to each other, Counselor Rose, the glue that binds them together, came into being. And she's this quirky anger management therapist who tries to help them find ways to survive in the city, to channel their anger and find inner peace. In one sitting, which lasted 3 days with barely any sleep, I had a skeleton script. I polished it whilst waiting for the whole COVID thing to end. Remember when it started, we just moved meetings to a month away, thinking that it would be over soon, and I was still in that mode. But it soon became clear that this was not going to be a fleeting moment, and that we would all be shut down for a while to come, and that meant that theatres too would be closed for the foreseeable future. So once again, the script sat in my laptop for months, and then I got a grant to create audio stories from the International Publishers Association, and I went back to the play script and adapted it into an audio drama. I looked for a cast of voice actors, booked a studio, and we recorded a 3-part 90-minute audio version, which is still available actually on Spotify and Anchor if you're interested, and it's free. So once the audio drama was done, I went back to the idea of the play, and I invited a group of friends who are writers, journalists, lovers of stories in general, to a session to review the script. I think one of the things that I'd learned from past experience, where I tended to work in complete isolation during the creation process, is that there is so much value in getting other people's opinions on your work. And actually, it was during one of that session in particular that Faith Oneya, a journalist and friend, said, "What would an anger management class look like during these pandemic times?" It probably happened on Zoom. And ding, light bulb moment. And that is how the film version that you're going to see today was born. And as there are many of you here that are film students, I wanted to share with you a bit about the adaptation and the filming process. So one of the first questions I had when adapting the stage play into a screenplay was, how do you make a film about a city during lockdown, knowing full well that the audience will never actually see even a glimpse of that city? Well, the easy answer, of course, is that, through what the characters say. The city makes the man, the woman, just as much as the man, the woman makes the city, right? But film is a visual format, and I needed a visual language too. So I thought back to how I design a set when I perform. Usually, as a storyteller, you don't have a massive team, so you do these kinds of jobs as well. And I absolutely hate playing on decorated stages, even for a poetry recital. I think that the space behind the actor, the poet, whoever it may be, is just so important. And so with characters essentially talking to you through a Zoom lens, your computer lens with a static background, but each in a different space, I took a lot of care to dress their backgrounds. Okay, I have to confess, it was all filmed in one location over a 4-day period, but each of them had to look like they were in a different place. And I wanted to make sure that their rooms said something about them. I won't say more about that so that I don't give you too many spoilers. Another thing that we really had to think carefully about was how to actually record it. Initially, we were very naive and we thought, we'll just record a Zoom call, But it quickly became clear that the video and sound quality wouldn't be good enough for a feature film. So we used proper cameras and had the actors simulate looking into their computer cameras or their phones, in the case of Sarah Obama. The director of photography, Gregory Kiwo, he came up with this great contraption so that Sarah Obama could hold the camera as you would a phone to get that kind of movement. So really, we had to innovate. And then Faith Musembi, the editor, literally, she did magic in the editing room. Post-production was a big part of this film. At script level, even before shooting, the lines had to be changed, especially how they each entered the space, because now they were entering into an online space. I also had to cut their backstories to make it less verbose, because these are just characters talking at you the whole time. And then also the outside scenes, which in the audio drama we had recreated, the search for the daughter, all of that had to go. The noisy policemen, the noisy streets, all of that, of course, had to go because we had no way of showing it because they were on a Zoom call. So there was a lot of rethinking and a lot of rewriting. And the honest truth is that none of us knew how it would turn out. We were all experimenting, the actors, the DOP, the editor, and I. None of us had made a Zoom film before. But the whole team, I think, really rose to the challenge. And I feel that regardless of the flaws the film may have, it's a testament to the strangest and craziest of times any of us have ever lived. Pandemic, lockdown, fear, anxiety, adaptation, loss, and also the incredible power we have as humans to keep going and to keep reinventing ourselves and our world. I have to admit that the film is also a manifesto of sorts. For me, it's an invitation for the viewers to look straight into the eyes of Jacinda, Louis, Sarah, and Diana, and to really listen to their struggles. And I guess ultimately, for me, it's also a message to my fellow African sisters and brothers that we are not powerless. As Councillor Rose says, all we need is more courage. I'd like to end by saying that this very, very convoluted journey that Tales of the Accidental City has taken me on, from short stories to stage play to audio drama and finally to a film, has taught me a really valuable lesson. And that's if a story wants to be told and needs to be told, it will find its way out. As tellers of stories, we should give ourselves the freedom to work across mediums, genres, and styles. And like water flowing in a river, we don't have to stop when we encounter a rock. We can just let the story take a new shape and continue on its journey. And finally, as an accidental filmmaker, I've also realized that you don't have to be an expert to experiment. Thank you.